The Israel-Palestine conflict is one of the most enduring and multifaceted struggles in human history. For Christians, it's a spiritual battle stretching back millennia, deeply tied to ancient prophecies and divine promises. For politicians, it's a timeless struggle over land and national identity. Regardless of the lens, this conflict represents a saga of passion, heritage, and unrelenting tension. Today, we'll journey into the heart of this complex enmity, unraveling biblical origins, prophetic revelations, and pivotal historical events that continue to shape this bitter divide. Prepare to gain insights that go beyond the surface. Before diving in, don't forget to subscribe to Daily Bible Stories, your gateway to understanding how ancient prophecies resonate in today's world. The roots of the Israel-Palestine conflict reach back thousands of years, beginning with the biblical story of Abraham and his two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Abraham, revered as the patriarch of both Jews and Arabs, received a divine promise from God that his descendants would inherit the land of Canaan. Genesis 12 verses 1-3. But the question of who would inherit this sacred promise sowed the seeds of division. Abraham fathered two sons, Ishmael, born to Hagar, an Egyptian slave, and Isaac, born to Sarah, his wife, in their old age. According to the Bible, God's covenant was established through Isaac and his lineage, making him the father of Jacob, whose descendants became the Israelites. This divine promise of land and blessings is the cornerstone of Jewish claims to the land of Israel. Genesis 17:1, 19-21. Yet Ishmael was not forgotten by God. In Genesis 16 verses 10-12, Ishmael was also promised greatness, becoming the patriarch of a great nation. His descendants are traditionally seen as the Arab people, including the Palestinians. This division of lineage has set the stage for a lasting conflict, as both Jews and Arabs lay claim to Abraham as their forefather and the land of Canaan as their heritage. At the center of this epic struggle lies a shared and unyielding attachment to the land of Israel. For Jews, it's not just their homeland. It's the fulfillment of a divine covenant. God's promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob guaranteed the land of Canaan, modern-day Israel and Palestine, as an eternal inheritance for their descendants. Genesis 15:1, 18-21. This promise is echoed throughout the Old Testament, reinforced in God's covenants with Moses and King David. Biblical prophecies also foretell the restoration of Israel in the end times, as described in Ezekiel 37 and Isaiah 66. These visions of Israel regathered and restored from exile are seen by many as fulfilled in 1948, when Israel was declared a nation after nearly 2,000 years of exile, following the horrors of the Holocaust. For Palestinians, the connection to the land is just as profound. Many trace their lineage to Ishmael and the ancient Canaanites, viewing the land as their ancestral home. Centuries of residence and cultural ties make this land integral to their identity and heritage. The founding of Israel in 1948 was a monumental moment in history, marking the realization of ancient prophecies for Jews. But for Palestinians, it was the dawn of displacement and devastation, a turning point they call the Nakba, catastrophe. This duality of triumph and tragedy fuels a conflict that transcends borders, resonating with themes of faith, identity, and historical justice. Join us as we explore the layers of this ancient conflict and uncover the truths that continue to shape its modern-day reality. To truly grasp the significance of 1948, we must journey back through the events that set the stage for the birth of the State of Israel, a story marked by hope, resilience, and deep-seated conflict. The seeds of the modern Israel-Palestine conflict were sown in the late 19th century with the rise of Zionism, a movement that sought to establish a Jewish homeland after centuries of persecution. Founded by visionary leader Theodor Herzl in 1897, Zionism wasn't just about reclaiming land. It was a bold answer to relentless pogroms in Eastern Europe and Russia, offering a dream of safety and sovereignty. At the time, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, home to a predominantly Arab Muslim population with smaller Christian and Jewish communities. Yet, for Zionists, this land wasn't just territory. It was the historic and spiritual cradle of Jewish identity, deeply rooted in biblical heritage and historical ties. Early in the 20th century, waves of Jewish immigrants began arriving, spurred by this dream and driven by the mounting threats to Jewish lives in Europe. This growing migration was given international legitimacy with the Balfour Declaration of 1917, when the British government pledged support for a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. For Jews worldwide, it was a beacon of hope. But for the local Arab population, it was a betrayal. The same British government had earlier promised Arab independence in exchange for their help in defeating the Ottoman Empire during World War I. When Britain assumed control of Palestine in 1918 under a League of Nations mandate, tensions began to boil. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, as Jewish immigration and land purchases surged, these tensions escalated into sporadic violence. Both Jews and Arabs felt a deep attachment to the land, but their visions for its future clashed. On one side, the Zionist dream of a Jewish homeland grew stronger. On the other, Arab nationalism, fueled by fears of displacement, demanded control over their ancestral land. By the 1930s, the stakes grew even higher as Adolf Hitler's rise to power sent waves of Jewish refugees fleeing Europe. Jewish immigration to Palestine soared, intensifying Arab fears that they were losing control of their homeland. The situation exploded into the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939, a massive uprising against British rule and the growing Jewish presence. While the British brutally suppressed the revolt, it left deep scars. Palestinians felt more embittered and alienated, while the Jewish community became even more determined to defend their people and their dream. Then came the Holocaust, a tragedy so unimaginable it shook the world. 6 million Jews were systematically exterminated by the Nazis, leaving survivors determined to find a refuge where such horrors could never happen again. For many, Palestine became the only hope. Tens of thousands of Holocaust survivors sought to immigrate there, only to find themselves blocked by British-imposed restrictions, as Britain struggled to placate Arab opposition and maintain its waning imperial control. Frustrated and desperate, Jewish paramilitary groups like Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi launched campaigns of resistance against British forces, demanding an end to immigration limits and British rule. Britain, drained by World War II and overwhelmed by escalating violence, turned the problem over to the newly formed United Nations in 1947. The UN proposed a daring solution: the Partition Plan of 1947, which sought to divide Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab, with Jerusalem under international control due to its religious importance to Jews, Christians, and Muslims. The plan allocated 55% of the land to the Jewish state and 45% to the Arab state. For Jews, it was a bittersweet triumph. After centuries of persecution and exile, they saw a chance to reclaim their homeland, even though the territory offered was small and fragmented. For Palestinians and the Arab world, however, it was an insult. At the time, Jews comprised only 30% of the population and owned less than 10% of the land. Yet the plan granted them the majority of the territory, including areas densely populated by Arabs. Arab leaders rejected the plan outright, viewing it as a colonial injustice imposed by foreign powers. To them, all of Palestine was Arab land, and the increasing Jewish presence was seen as an illegitimate colonization project. This rejection set the stage for the explosive events of 1948, a year that would bring both jubilation and tragedy, a year that would forever alter the course of history in the Middle East. Jewish leaders, led by David Ben-Gurion, embraced the UN Partition Plan with cautious optimism. Though imperfect, they saw it as the best chance to realize a dream thousands of years in the making: the establishment of a sovereign Jewish state. On May 14, 1948, as the British mandate in Palestine officially ended, Ben-Gurion made a historic declaration: the birth of the State of Israel. The celebration was short-lived. Within 24 hours, armies from 5 neighboring Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, invaded, vowing to annihilate the fledgling state before it could take root. This was the start of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, a conflict that Israelis would later call their War of Independence, and Palestinians would mourn as the Nakba or catastrophe. For Israel, the war was a battle for survival against overwhelming odds. But for Palestinians, it was a tragedy of unprecedented proportions. Over 700,000 Palestinians were displaced during the conflict, some fleeing in fear of violence, others forcibly expelled by advancing Israeli forces. Entire villages were emptied and razed, leaving behind a shattered Palestinian society. Refugees poured into neighboring countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt, while others sought refuge in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The reasons for this mass exodus remain hotly contested. Israeli historians argue that many Palestinians left voluntarily, believing Arab armies would swiftly win and reclaim the land. Palestinian scholars, however, highlight deliberate expulsions carried out by Jewish militias, particularly during military operations such as Plan Dalet, which aimed to secure strategic areas for the new state. Whatever the causes, the consequences were devastating. A massive, stateless Palestinian population and a deep sense of injustice that would fuel decades of resistance. When the war ended in 1949, the armistice agreements redrew the map of the region. Israel emerged victorious, controlling 78% of historic Palestine, a far greater share than envisioned in the UN partition plan. The remaining territories, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip, fell under the control of Jordan and Egypt, respectively. For Palestinians, this was the beginning of their national trauma. The loss of their homeland, the destruction of their society, and the birth of a refugee crisis that persists to this day. The Nakba is far more than a historical event for Palestinians. It is a defining chapter of their identity. Each year, on May 15th, Palestinians commemorate Nakba Day, mourning the displacement of their people and demanding recognition of their rights. Central to this is the right of return, a demand that Palestinian refugees and their descendants be allowed to return to the homes and lands from which they were uprooted in 1948. For millions of Palestinians, the memory of the Nakba is a source of both pain and purpose, a rallying cry for justice, restoration, and the establishment of a state they can call their own. The events of 1948 not only changed the map but also created two competing national narratives. For Jews, it was a story of triumph and rebirth, the fulfillment of an ancient promise. For Palestinians, it was a story of loss and dispossession, a catastrophe that shattered their homeland. These conflicting histories have shaped the collective identities of both peoples and continue to be a barrier to peace. 2 decades later, the 1967 Six-Day War would reshape the region once again, solidifying the foundation of today's conflict. For Israel, the war was an extraordinary military victory, resulting in the capture of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza Strip, and Golan Heights, territories that tripled the size of the nation and gave it unprecedented control. For Palestinians and the Arab world, it marked the start of a prolonged occupation that would deepen resentment and resistance. The Six-Day War's impact was monumental, altering the geopolitical, social, and spiritual dimensions of the Middle East. It cemented unresolved issues that remain central to the Israel-Palestine conflict: borders, refugees, settlements, and the status of Jerusalem. To understand the conflict today, one must understand the wars of 1948 and 1967, watersheds in a struggle that continues to shape the destiny of millions. This is a story of competing dreams, shared anguish, and unyielding ties to a land both sides call home. It's a story that is far from over. The Six-Day War wasn't a sudden eruption but the climax of years of mounting tension between Israel and its Arab neighbors, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq. Following the birth of Israel in 1948, these tensions were driven by deep-seated animosities and unresolved conflicts. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War, hailed by Israelis as their war of independence and mourned by Palestinians as the Nakba catastrophe, left scars that would fester for decades. Arab nations, led by Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, refused to recognize Israel's existence and remained committed to overturning the results of the war. Arab nationalism, championed by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, sought to unify the Arab world in opposition to Israel. Territorial disputes loomed large. The West Bank controlled by Jordan, the Gaza Strip held by Egypt, and the Golan Heights under Syria's authority all became flashpoints for conflict. In the years leading up to the Six-Day War, border skirmishes became routine, and the region simmered with the possibility of an explosive showdown. The Suez Crisis of 1956 added fuel to the fire. When Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Israel, in collaboration with Britain and France, launched an invasion of Egypt. Though Israel ultimately withdrew under international pressure, the crisis deepened animosity between Israel and Egypt, laying the groundwork for future hostilities. The Cold War added another layer of complexity, with the Soviet Union heavily backing Egypt and Syria while Israel increasingly aligned with the United States and Western powers. In May 1967, the tension boiled over. Nasser escalated the situation by closing the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, effectively blockading the port of Eilat and cutting off Israel's vital maritime access to the Red Sea. For Israel, this was nothing short of an act of war. As Arab forces mobilized along Israel's borders, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq all preparing for conflict, the tiny nation felt encircled, outnumbered, and existentially threatened. Then came June 5, 1967, a day that changed the course of history. In a daring gamble for survival, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, marking the start of the Six-Day War. The Israeli Air Force, executing the meticulously planned Operation Focus, destroyed nearly the entire Egyptian Air Force while it was still on the ground. This bold move crippled Egypt's military capabilities and gave Israel undisputed control of the skies. Over the next 6 days, Israel waged battles on multiple fronts, defeating Egypt, Jordan, and Syria with remarkable efficiency. By the time the war ended on June 10, 1967, Israel had achieved a stunning series of victories. It seized the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, captured the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, took control of the Golan Heights from Syria. In just 6 days, Israel had tripled its territory, fundamentally redrawing the map of the Middle East. The capture of East Jerusalem, home to the Old City and its sacred sites, including the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, was celebrated as nothing short of miraculous by Israelis. This victory not only secured Israel's borders, but also bolstered its sense of national pride and military prowess. However, the war's aftermath was far from simple. Israel now controlled large Arab populations in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, inaugurating what would become a deeply controversial occupation of these territories. For Palestinians, this occupation became the defining struggle of their pursuit of independence and statehood. Globally, the occupation sparked intense debate, particularly as Israeli settlements began expanding across the West Bank. The unification of Jerusalem under Israeli control was seen as a symbolic triumph, bringing the Western Wall back into Jewish hands after nearly 2,000 years. Yet, for Palestinians and the Arab world, the loss of East Jerusalem, home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Dome of the Rock, was a devastating blow. These sites, among the holiest in Islam, became symbols of the enduring struggle for Palestinian sovereignty. The Six-Day War cemented Israel's position as a regional power but also deepened the divide between Israelis and Palestinians. It transformed the Middle East, leaving a legacy of territorial disputes, religious tensions, and unfulfilled aspirations that continue to define the conflict today. This was not just a war of borders. It was a battle for identity, faith, and survival. For some, it was a miracle. For others, it was a catastrophe. For the world, it was a moment that reshaped history. Israel's capture of the Golan Heights during the Six-Day War was a game-changer, giving the nation a critical strategic advantage and creating a buffer against potential northern attacks. However, Syria's ongoing demand for its return has turned the Golan Heights into a contentious flashpoint in Israeli-Syrian relations, a symbol of unresolved tensions that continue to haunt the region. The war didn't just redraw borders. It deepened the Palestinian refugee crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were forcibly displaced from the newly occupied territories, swelling the numbers of refugees already displaced during the Nakba of 1948. These people were never allowed to return, cementing feelings of injustice and making the path to peace even more difficult to navigate. Israel's dramatic success in the Six-Day War wasn't achieved in isolation. Behind the battlefield victories lay the crucial support of international allies. The United States, though the U.S. didn't fight in the Six-Day War, it played a pivotal role in the lead-up to the conflict. Amid the Cold War, the U.S. viewed Israel as a strategic ally in the Middle East, countering Soviet-backed Arab states like Egypt and Syria. Washington provided Israel with critical military equipment, including aircraft, tanks, and artillery, ensuring its forces were well prepared for the battles ahead. France. Before the war, France was Israel's closest arms supplier. French-made Mirage 3 fighter jets were instrumental in Israel's stunning air superiority. Yet, following the war, France distanced itself from Israel, shifting its support toward Arab nations, signaling a significant geopolitical shift. A Soviet Union. On the Arab side, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan leaned heavily on the Soviet Union for military training, financial aid, and advanced weaponry. The USSR saw these nations as vital partners in the Cold War. But even with substantial Soviet backing, the lack of coordination among Arab forces left them vulnerable to Israel's precision strikes and bold tactics. The Six-Day War transformed the region. Israel tripled its territory, securing the West Bank, Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, fundamentally altering the political map of the Middle East. For Israelis, this was a triumph, a testament to their resilience and military ingenuity. For Palestinians and the Arab world, it was a devastating blow, cementing an occupation that would fuel decades of anger and resistance. In the war's aftermath, the United Nations passed Resolution 242, calling for Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories and the recognition of every state's right to live in peace. But the resolution's vague wording, especially regarding the extent of Israel's withdrawal, created a legal and political ambiguity that persists to this day, keeping the core issues of the conflict unresolved. Israel's post-war dominance paved the way for the construction of settlements in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. These settlements, deemed illegal under international law by most of the global community, have since expanded significantly, creating a complex web of political, demographic, and territorial challenges that make a two-state solution increasingly elusive. For Palestinians, the Six-Day War was a rallying cry for nationalism. Movements like Fatah and the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, gained momentum, demanding the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. Their struggle evolved into a mix of political efforts and armed resistance, signaling that the fight for Palestinian sovereignty was far from over. The Six-Day War wasn't just a military conflict. It was a seismic event that reshaped the Middle East. It secured Israel's survival and expanded its borders, but left behind a legacy of occupation, displacement, and conflict. The war's aftermath, marked by the enduring struggle over Jerusalem, the plight of Palestinian refugees, and the growth of Israeli settlements, remains at the heart of the Israel-Palestine conflict. This war didn't just redraw borders. It created a new reality. For some, it was a miraculous victory. For others, it was a catastrophe that defined decades of hardship. The Six-Day War's impact still resonates, shaping the political, social, and human dimensions of one of the world's most enduring conflicts. This was not just a clash of armies. It was a turning point that continues to define the destiny of millions. At the core of the spiritual view of the Israel-Palestine conflict lies a divine covenant, a timeless promise made by God to Abraham and his descendants. This covenant, more than a spiritual bond, centers on a specific and sacred piece of land, Canaan, promised as an eternal inheritance. In Genesis 12 verses 1-3, God calls Abraham to leave everything behind and trust in his divine plan. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household and go to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. To your offspring, I will give this land. The significance of this promise is amplified in Genesis 15:1, 18-21, where God outlines the boundaries of the land, stretching from the Nile River to the Euphrates. It is described not as a temporary possession but as an everlasting inheritance. Genesis 17 verses 7-8. This covenant forms the foundation of the Jewish claim to the land of Israel and Jerusalem, as the Jewish people see themselves as heirs to this divine promise. For many Christians, the covenant with Abraham remains alive and relevant today. They believe God's promises are eternal, and the land of Israel was divinely granted as part of his sovereign plan. This belief transforms the conflict over the land into something far greater than politics or territorial disputes. It becomes a cosmic struggle, with attempts to deny Jewish claims seen as challenges to God's divine will. Throughout the Old Testament, there are powerful prophecies about the scattering of the Jewish people, their exile, and their eventual return to the land of Israel. These prophecies paint a vivid picture of hope and restoration, foretelling a time when Israel would rise from its ashes, regathered from the nations. Many Christians believe this process began in the 20th century, culminating in the miraculous events of 1948. Among these prophecies, Ezekiel 37 stands out for its striking imagery. The prophet Ezekiel is shown a valley filled with dry bones, symbolizing the scattered people of Israel. In this vision, God declares, "I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord." Ezekiel 37 verses 5 to 6. Later, in Ezekiel 37 verse 21, God promises, "I will bring the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone. I will gather them from all around and bring them back into their own land." For many believers, the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948 is the direct fulfillment of this prophecy. After nearly 2,000 years of exile, beginning with the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, the Jewish people returned to their ancestral homeland. To many, this was more than a historical milestone. It was a miraculous sign that God's plan was unfolding, signaling the approach of the end times. If Israel is the centerpiece of God's divine plan, then Jerusalem is its crowning jewel. The city holds a profound spiritual resonance, revered in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But its biblical significance transcends its historical and religious importance. Jerusalem is described in the Bible as the city where God chose to place his name and dwell among his people. In 2 Chronicles 6 verse 6, God proclaims, "But now I have chosen Jerusalem for my name to be there, and I have chosen David to rule my people Israel." Throughout the scriptures, Jerusalem is depicted as the spiritual epicenter of God's activity on earth. It is where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac, where King David established his throne, and where Solomon built the first temple, a sacred place symbolizing God's presence among his people. Yet, Jerusalem's significance extends far beyond history. The book of Zechariah describes its role in the end times, foretelling a period when Jerusalem will become the center of global conflict and divine intervention. In Zechariah 12 verses 2 to 3, God warns, "I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling. On that day, when all the nations of the earth are gathered against her, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations. All who try to move it will injure themselves." For many Christians, the modern-day struggle over Jerusalem, claimed as a capital by both Israel and Palestine, is seen as a direct fulfillment of Zechariah's prophecy. In 1967, during the Six-Day War, Israel captured East Jerusalem, including the Old City, bringing the entire city under Israeli control for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. This moment was celebrated as a prophetic milestone, as it returned the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, to Jewish hands. For Christians who view the conflict through a spiritual lens, this event was more than a military victory. It was a sign of God's plan unfolding. Jerusalem, the city of David, the city of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, was back under the control of the people to whom it was promised in the Bible. Despite its unifying spiritual significance, Jerusalem remains a focal point of division. Its sacred sites, including the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, are also among the holiest in Islam, making the city a flashpoint in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Both Israelis and Palestinians claim it as their capital, making it one of the most contentious issues in peace negotiations. For many, Jerusalem is not just a city. It is a symbol of hope, a testament to faith, and the heart of a divine narrative that continues to unfold. The struggle over Jerusalem, seen by some as a geopolitical crisis, is viewed by others as part of a larger spiritual battle, a cosmic war between God's eternal promises and the forces that seek to defy them. Whether seen through the lens of faith or politics, Jerusalem's story is far from over. It remains a city of prophecy, a city of conflict, and, perhaps, a city of redemption yet to come. The occupation of East Jerusalem has become a flashpoint in the Israel-Palestine conflict, fueling tensions with Palestinians who see it as the capital of their future state. But this struggle goes beyond politics. It touches the soul of a city that holds profound religious and prophetic significance. According to the Bible, Jerusalem stands at the center of the ultimate battle between good and evil, a focal point for the final chapters of human history. The Book of Revelation and other apocalyptic scriptures speak of a climactic series of wars that will culminate in Armageddon, the ultimate showdown between the forces of darkness and the armies of God. Revelation 16 verse 16 describes, "Then they gathered the kings together to the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon." The word Armageddon, derived from the Hebrew Har Megiddo, refers to a valley near Jerusalem long associated with the prophesied final battle. This is where tradition holds the Antichrist will face the forces of God in the ultimate confrontation. The book of Zechariah also foretells of this day. "Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations, as he fights on a day of battle. On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem." Zechariah 14 verses 3 to 4. For many Christians, these prophecies place Jerusalem at the very heart of the spiritual and geopolitical struggles of our age. The current battles over the city's status and control are seen not as isolated events, but as signs of the approaching fulfillment of end-times prophecies. To many believers, the conflict over Jerusalem is far more than a political or territorial dispute. It is a spiritual war. In this view, the forces of Satan seek to destroy Israel and disrupt God's eternal plan. The opposition to Israel, whether from Palestinian groups, neighboring Arab nations, or international critics, is often seen as part of a larger spiritual warfare. The Book of Daniel offers a glimpse into these unseen battles, describing angelic forces clashing with the spiritual Prince of Persia and Prince of Greece, representing the earthly powers of these nations. Many interpret these passages as evidence that similar spiritual forces are influencing the modern Israel-Palestine conflict, attempting to undermine God's purposes for his chosen people. More profoundly, the struggle over Jerusalem is seen as a microcosm of a cosmic war between the kingdom of God and the forces of darkness. For Christians, this is not just a fight over sovereignty or borders. It is about the culmination of God's plan to redeem the world through Jesus Christ, who will one day return to rule from Jerusalem and establish his eternal kingdom. Beyond its spiritual importance, Jerusalem is a city deeply divided by political and territorial disputes. For Israel, uniting the city under its control, especially after capturing East Jerusalem during the Six-Day War, was a historic and symbolic victory. The reunification brought the Western Wall, Judaism's holiest site, back into Jewish hands for the first time in nearly 2,000 years. For Palestinians, however, East Jerusalem remains the cornerstone of their aspirations for statehood. They claim it as the capital of their future state, making its status one of the most contentious issues in the conflict. The international community, including the United Nations, does not recognize Israeli sovereignty over East Jerusalem, viewing it as occupied territory. The two-state solution, envisioning an independent Palestine alongside Israel, remains the most widely proposed framework for peace. Yet decades of negotiations have failed to bridge the deep divisions over Jerusalem's status, borders, and the right of return for Palestinian refugees. The battle for Jerusalem is not just a political challenge or a theological debate. It is a defining struggle for identity, faith, and the future of a region and a people. For some, the conflict is a sign of the end times, the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. For others, it is the ultimate test of diplomacy and coexistence. What do you think? Is the Israel-Palestine conflict primarily a spiritual battle, a political struggle, or both? Share your perspective in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Daily Bible Stories for thought-provoking insights into how ancient prophecies shape our modern world. This is not just history. It's a story still being written, a story that may hold the key to the future of the world.